I stood on the sidewalk with 2 garbage bags containing everything my son deemed worthy of my 43 years of marriage, watching the front door of what used to be my home slam shut in my face. The funeral reception had ended barely an hour ago, and already Marcus had made it clear I was no longer welcome in the house his father and I had built together. My hands were still shaking from the cold March wind, or maybe from shock, I couldn't tell anymore. In my coat pocket, my fingers brushed against a small plastic card I'd forgotten I even had, and in that moment, I had no idea that this forgotten piece of plastic would change everything in the next 72 hours. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dorothy Chambers, and 3 days ago I buried my husband of 43 years. Richard had been my everything since I was 19 years old. A college dropout who fell in love with a charming accounting student who promised me the world. I gave up my scholarship to NYU to support his career, moving from state to state as he climbed the corporate ladder, raising our son Marcus in 7 different cities before we finally settled in Riverside Heights 15 years ago. I never regretted those choices, not once, because Richard always made me feel like we were a team, like my sacrifices mattered, like I was building something beautiful alongside him. The heart attack took him on a Tuesday morning. One moment he was reading the newspaper at our kitchen table, complaining about the city council's latest zoning decisions, and the next he was clutching his chest, his face going gray, his eyes wide with fear. I called 911, performed CPR the way I'd learned in that community class I'd taken years ago, but by the time the ambulance arrived I already knew. There's a particular kind of stillness that settles over a person when life leaves them, and I'd seen it wash over Richard's face even as I pressed my hands against his chest, even as I begged him not to leave me. The funeral had been yesterday, a somber affair at Riverside Memorial Chapel. Marcus had handled all the arrangements, which I'd been grateful for in my fog of grief. He'd chosen the casket, selected the flowers, written the obituary, and organized the reception at our home. Or rather, what I'd thought was our home. Richard's colleagues from 40 years in corporate finance had filled the chapel, sharing stories about his brilliance with numbers, his integrity, his dedication to his clients. Our neighbors had come, the Hendersons from next door who we'd watched grow from newlyweds to parents of 3, the Kowalskis from across the street who Richard had helped with their taxes every year for a decade. Even some of Marcus's childhood friends had appeared, now adults with families of their own, paying respects to a man who'd coached their little league teams and attended their high school graduations. But it was during the reception, as I moved through my own living room like a ghost, accepting condolences and picking at the catered sandwiches I couldn't taste, that I began to notice something strange. Marcus kept pulling people aside, having hushed conversations in corners, glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. His wife Jennifer, who I'd always gotten along with reasonably well, avoided making eye contact with me entirely. Their 2 children, my grandchildren Emma and Lucas, stayed close to their parents instead of seeking comfort from me, the way they usually did when they were upset. When the last guest finally left, when the catering staff had cleaned up and departed, Marcus asked me to sit down in the living room. Jennifer stood behind him, her arms crossed, her face carefully neutral. I'd lowered myself onto the sofa where Richard and I had watched television together for 15 years, where we'd held hands during scary movies and shared popcorn on Friday nights, and I'd waited for whatever my son needed to tell me. What he told me shattered what remained of my already broken heart. The house, he explained in a voice that was far too calm, had been put in his name 2 years ago. Richard had made him co-owner on the deed, and now that Richard was gone, the house belonged entirely to Marcus. Furthermore, Richard's life insurance policy, the one I'd assumed would help me survive the coming years, had been changed 8 months ago to list Marcus as the sole beneficiary. The retirement accounts, the investment portfolio Richard had carefully built over 4 decades, everything had been restructured to bypass me entirely and go directly to our son. I'd sat there in stunned silence as Marcus continued, explaining that this had all been Richard's idea, that Dad had been worried about me being taken advantage of if I came into a large sum of money, that Dad had thought it would be better if Marcus managed everything and provided me with a small monthly allowance. I'd wanted to scream that Richard would never do such a thing, that my husband had always made sure I felt secure, that this had to be some terrible mistake. But the papers Marcus showed me, the legal documents with Richard's signature, they told a different story. Then came the final blow. Marcus informed me that he and Jennifer had decided to sell the house. They needed the equity to invest in Jennifer's sister's restaurant venture. And besides, the house was too large, too expensive to maintain. They'd already contacted a realtor, who thought they could list it within the month. And as for me, well, Marcus suggested I might want to look into senior living communities or perhaps rent a small apartment somewhere more affordable than Riverside Heights. I'd asked about the allowance he'd mentioned, the money Richard had supposedly wanted Marcus to give me. Marcus had shifted uncomfortably, explaining that the monthly amount would be $1,500, barely enough to cover rent in even the cheapest neighborhoods, certainly not enough to maintain the lifestyle I'd grown accustomed to. When I'd protested, when I'd pointed out that I'd given up my own education and career to support Richard's success, that I'd earned the right to share in what we'd built together, Marcus's expression had hardened. He told me that I'd been living off Dad's hard work for 43 years, that I'd never contributed financially to the family, that it was time I learned to stand on my own 2 feet. Jennifer had nodded along, adding that perhaps some independence would be good for me, that I'd been too dependent on Richard, that this was an opportunity for personal growth. The words had felt like knives, each one carefully aimed at the parts of me that were already bleeding. I tried to reason with them, tried to explain that Richard and I had always made decisions together, that being a homemaker and supporting partner had been our mutual choice, not some failure on my part. But Marcus had simply shrugged, unmoved by my tears, unbothered by my desperation. He'd given me until the end of the week to pack my essential belongings, anything that wasn't furniture or fixtures that would help stage the house for sale. Then he'd suggested I might want to stay with one of my friends while I figured out my next steps. That's when I'd realized I had nowhere to go. My friends were all couples, and staying with them meant being the third wheel, the reminder of mortality that nobody wanted in their guest room for more than a night or two. My sister lived in Oregon, barely able to make ends meet on her disability payments, with no room for a long-term house guest. My parents had passed away years ago, and Richard's family had never been particularly warm to me, always seeming to view me as the woman who trapped their golden boy into early marriage. I'd spent the night in the guest bedroom, the room that had once been Marcus's childhood sanctuary, surrounded by boxes I'd mechanically packed with clothing and personal items, my mind spinning with disbelief. This couldn't be happening. Richard wouldn't have left me destitute. He wouldn't have put everything in Marcus's name without discussing it with me first. We talked about our future, about the retirement we'd planned, about traveling to all the places we'd never had time to visit during his working years. None of those plans had involved me being dependent on our son's charity. But the next morning, when I tried once more to talk to Marcus, to make him understand how impossible this situation was, he'd lost his patience entirely. He told me I had until noon to be out of the house, that he needed to start preparing the property for listing, that the realtor was coming by in the afternoon for an initial walkthrough. When I protested that I had nowhere to go, that I needed more time, he'd actually called me manipulative, accused me of trying to use emotional blackmail to change his mind. Jennifer had appeared in the doorway with 2 large garbage bags, the heavy-duty black kind you use for yard waste, and told me these would be sufficient for whatever I needed to take. Everything else, she'd said cheerfully, would be donated or sold with the house. I'd stared at those garbage bags, understanding with horrible clarity that to my son and his wife, I was just another thing to be disposed of, cleared out, thrown away to make room for their new investment opportunity. So I'd packed what I could into those 2 bags, my hands shaking with humiliation and rage. Some clothing, toiletries, a few photographs that Marcus hadn't already claimed for his own house, my mother's jewelry that Jennifer had looked at with barely concealed disappointment when she'd realized none of it was particularly valuable. I'd put on my heavy coat, the navy wool one Richard had bought me for our 40th anniversary, and I'd walked out the front door, dragging those garbage bags behind me, my entire life reduced to what I could carry. Marcus had stood in the doorway watching me go, his face hard and closed off, looking nothing like the little boy I'd rocked to sleep, nothing like the teenager I'd driven to soccer practice, nothing like the young man I'd helped move into his first apartment. Jennifer had appeared beside him, slipping her hand into his, and together they'd looked like a united front against the crazy old woman who just wouldn't accept reality. When I turned back one last time, hoping for some sign of remorse or hesitation, The door had simply closed, the lock clicking into place with a finality that echoed in my chest. Now I stood on the sidewalk in the pale March sunlight, watching a few dry leaves skitter past my feet, trying to figure out what to do next. I had $63 in my purse, whatever was left in my checking account, which couldn't be much since Richard had always handled our finances, and no plan whatsoever. My cell phone showed it was just past noon, and I realized I hadn't eaten anything since yesterday afternoon. My stomach too knotted with grief and shock to accept food. I thought about calling someone, but who? My friend Margaret, who I'd had lunch with every Thursday for 8 years. I could already imagine the awkward sympathy in her voice, the way she'd offer me her guest room for a night or two while carefully making it clear this couldn't be a permanent solution. Barbara from my book club? She'd recently moved into a retirement community herself, a fancy place with golf courses and a pool.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Definitely not set up for destitute house guests. Susan, who I'd volunteered with at the community center. She'd moved to Florida last year to be near her own children, sending cheerful postcards about beaches and early bird specials. The truth was that I'd spent 43 years being Richard's wife, Marcus's mother, a supporting character in other people's stories. I'd never developed the kind of deep, independent friendships that could weather something like this, never built a life separate enough from my family that I had somewhere else to belong. And now at 62 years old, I was completely alone. I started walking, dragging my garbage bags behind me, because standing still felt impossible. The neighborhood looked different somehow, though nothing had actually changed. The Hendersons' house still had its perfectly manicured lawn. The Kowalskis still had their ridiculous garden gnome collection. The corner store where I'd bought milk and bread for 15 years still had the same cheerful bell that rang when you opened the door. But I wasn't part of this neighborhood anymore. I was just a woman with garbage bags, someone to glance at and then quickly look away from, someone who'd clearly fallen on hard times and might ask for help if you made eye contact. I'd walked for maybe 20 minutes, my arms aching from dragging the bags, my feet starting to hurt in the heels I'd worn for the funeral and never changed out of, when I passed Riverside Community Bank. The building was small, a local branch that Richard had used occasionally when he needed to handle something in person rather than online. I'd been inside maybe 3 times in 15 years, always with Richard, always just standing beside him while he discussed complicated financial matters with suited professionals who spoke in a language I'd never learned. But looking at that bank now, I remembered something. Years ago, maybe 20 years, I'd had my own account there. It was before everything got merged into joint accounts, before Richard convinced me that it was simpler to have all our finances in one place. I'd been part of some kind of community initiative, a neighborhood watch program that had collected dues for supplies and events, and I'd been the treasurer for a year or 2. I'd opened an account specifically for that purpose, kept meticulous records, and when the program eventually dissolved, I'd forgotten all about it. In my coat pocket, my fingers found the small plastic card I'd brushed against earlier. I pulled it out, squinting at it in the sunlight. It was old, the plastic yellowed with age, the magnetic strip probably long defunct. But there it was. Riverside Community Bank, and my name Dorothy Chambers, embossed across the bottom. I had absolutely no idea if there was anything in that account, if the account even still existed after 2 decades of inactivity, but suddenly I needed to know. I dragged my garbage bags up to the bank entrance, feeling the stares of other customers as I struggled through the door. The interior was exactly as I remembered it, all cream-colored walls and motivational posters about saving for your future, teller windows with that specific bank smell of paper and air conditioning. A young woman at the information desk looked up as I approached, her professional smile faltering slightly as she took in my appearance, the garbage bags, the desperation I was sure showed on my face. "I need to check on an account," I said, my voice coming out smaller than I'd intended. I held up the ancient bank card. "I'm not sure if it's still active." The young woman, her name tag read Ashley, took the card carefully, as if it might crumble in her fingers. "This is quite old," she said, not unkindly. "Let me see what I can find. Do you have identification?" I fumbled in my purse for my driver's license, handed it over, watched as Ashley typed information into her computer. Her expression shifted from polite helpfulness to confusion, then to something that looked almost like alarm. She glanced up at me, then back at her screen, then at me again. "Mrs. Chambers," she said slowly, I'm going to need to get my manager. Please, if you could just wait here for one moment. She disappeared into a back office, leaving me standing there with my garbage bags, feeling every eye in the bank turning toward me. The other customers, people in business suits conducting their lunch hour banking, clearly thought I was some kind of homeless person who'd wandered in off the street. A security guard had even taken a step closer, his hand resting on his radio, ready to escort me out if I caused trouble. When Ashley returned, she was followed by a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, his gray hair perfectly styled, his expression carefully controlled. He approached me directly, and I noticed his eyes widen almost imperceptibly as he looked at me, really looked at me, seeing past the garbage bags and the disheveled appearance. "Mrs. Chambers," he said, and his voice held a note of something I couldn't identify. "I'm Vincent Carrington, the branch manager. Would you please come with me to my office? We have some important matters to discuss." I followed him, dragging my bags, feeling the weight of everyone's stares. His office was plush, all dark wood and leather chairs, with diplomas and certificates covering one wall. He closed the door behind us, gestured for me to sit, then settled behind his desk with the air of someone about to deliver serious news. "Mrs. Chambers," he began, looking at the old bank card Ashley had given him. "I need to verify something with you. Did you know Richard Chambers personally?" "He was my husband," I said, confusion mixing with the exhaustion threatening to pull me under. "He died 3 days ago." Vincent Carrington's expression shifted to something that looked like genuine shock. "I'm very sorry for your loss," he said quietly. "Mrs. Chambers, I need to ask you something else. Were you aware of the full extent of your husband's financial arrangements?" I shook my head, feeling tears threatening again. Apparently I wasn't aware of anything. My son just informed me that everything was put in his name. The house, the life insurance, everything. I gestured helplessly at my garbage bags thrown out. Vincent was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled in front of him, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Mrs. Chambers, the account connected to this card, it's not quite what you think it is." "There's nothing in it," I said flatly. "I figured as much. It's been inactive for 20 years. I just thought maybe there was $50 or something that could get me through today." Vincent shook his head slowly. "Mrs. Chambers, this account was restructured approximately 8 months ago. It's no longer a simple checking account. It's what we call a primary control account." I stared at him blankly. "I don't understand what that means." He pulled up something on his computer, turned the screen so I could see it, and I found myself looking at numbers that made no sense. "Mrs. Chambers, your husband restructured his entire financial portfolio 8 months ago. He created a complex trust structure, and this account, the one you opened 20 years ago, it's the controlling account for that trust." "I still don't understand," I whispered. Vincent's voice was very gentle. "Mrs. Chambers, your husband put everything into a trust. The house, the investments, the life insurance, all of it. And he made you the sole trustee. This account has signing authority over approximately $8.3 million in assets." The words hung in the air between us, impossible, incomprehensible. $8.3 million. That couldn't be right. Richard had been successful, yes, but we'd never lived extravagantly, never acted like people who had that kind of money. And besides, Marcus had just shown me papers that proved everything belonged to him now. "That's not possible," I said. "My son showed me documents. Everything went to him. Richard changed everything before he died." Vincent's expression hardened slightly. "Mrs. Chambers, I'm going to need to see those documents. Because from what I'm looking at here, your son has no legal authority over any of your husband's assets. In fact, he appears to have been given the mistaken impression that he was a beneficiary, when in reality, he's simply listed as a potential secondary trustee, only assuming control if something happened to you." The implications started to sink in slowly, like cold water seeping through cracks. "You're saying Marcus lied to me?" "I'm saying someone either made a very serious error in interpreting these legal documents, or someone deliberately misrepresented their contents to you." Vincent's voice had taken on an edge. "Mrs. Chambers, did you sign anything in the last few days? Any papers your son presented to you?" I shook my head. "He didn't ask me to sign anything. He just showed me papers and told me what they meant." Vincent stood up. "Mrs. Chambers, I need to make some phone calls. But first, I need to ask you something very important." Did your son access any of your husband's bank accounts since his death? I don't know, I admitted. He handled all the funeral arrangements. He might have needed to access accounts to pay for things. Vincent's jaw tightened. Please excuse me for just a few minutes. I need to check something immediately. He left me alone in his office, and I sat there surrounded by my garbage bags, trying to process what he'd told me. $8.3 million. Sole trustee. Marcus had lied. The pieces weren't quite fitting together yet, but I was starting to understand that the story Marcus had told me, the one about Richard wanting to protect me by putting everything in Marcus's name, that story was false. When Vincent returned, his face was grim. Mrs. Chambers, I have some difficult news. Your son accessed your husband's primary account yesterday, using power of attorney documents. He withdrew $150,000 in cash and transferred another $300,000 to an account in his name at a different bank. The room tilted slightly. Marcus had stolen from me. From Richard. From the estate. Vincent continued, his voice steady and professional. However, those accounts were not actually part of your husband's primary holdings. They were essentially decoy accounts. Your husband was quite sophisticated in his estate planning. He left money in easily accessible accounts, perhaps anticipating that someone might try to access them improperly. Why would he do that? I asked. Why would Richard set all this up and not tell me? Vincent returned to his seat, his expression sympathetic. Mrs. Chambers, your husband came to see me 8 months ago. He'd just been diagnosed with a serious heart condition, and his doctors had told him he likely had less than 2 years to live. He was very concerned about protecting you, but he was also concerned about your son. What do you mean concerned? Vincent hesitated. He said that Marcus had been pressuring him for money for years. Business ventures that failed, investments that went bad, always needing just a little more to get back on his feet. Your husband loved his son, but he didn't trust his judgment with money. And he was worried that if something happened to him, Marcus would find a way to take advantage of you. The words landed like physical blows. Richard had known. He'd known Marcus was unreliable, possibly even untrustworthy, and he'd spent the last months of his life setting up protections for me. And then he'd died before he could explain any of it to me. So what does this mean? I asked. What happens now? Vincent's expression turned determined. Now, Mrs. Chambers, we're going to fix this. First, I'm going to freeze all accounts that your son accessed. He made those transactions using power of attorney documents that became invalid the moment your husband passed away. That money will be recovered and returned to the trust. He can't just keep the money. He committed fraud, Mrs. Chambers. He used invalid documents to access funds that don't belong to him, and he did so with clear knowledge that his father had passed away, and the power of attorney was no longer valid. Vincent's voice was firm. I'm also going to contact the executor of your husband's estate. According to these records, that's the law firm of Patterson and Associates downtown. They'll need to be informed of what's happened. I sat there, overwhelmed, trying to absorb everything. My son, the child I'd raised, the boy I'd sacrificed my education for, my career for, my own identity for, he'd stolen from me. He'd looked me in the eye, told me I was broke and homeless, thrown me out with garbage bags, all while knowing he'd just stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars that rightfully belonged to me. Mrs. Chambers, Vincent said gently, do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight? Because I don't think you should go back to that house until we've sorted this situation out legally. I don't have anywhere, I admitted. That's why I was walking around with these bags. I have nowhere to go. Vincent thought for a moment. The bank has a relationship with the Riverside Hotel, the nice one downtown by the waterfront. Let me make a call. We'll get you a room for as long as you need it, charged to an emergency expense account. You shouldn't be on the street, not while we're sorting this out. Within an hour, Vincent had made a series of calls that set my new reality in motion. The accounts Marcus had accessed were frozen, triggering automatic alerts that would notify him his cards and transfers had been declined. The law firm handling Richard's estate had been contacted and was sending someone to meet with me first thing in the morning. And I had a reservation at the Riverside Hotel, where a suite was waiting for me, far nicer than anything I'd ever stayed in during my marriage to Richard. Before I left the bank, Vincent handed me a new bank card, this one updated and functional, connected to what he called a liquid account with immediate access to $50,000 for my expenses while the estate was being settled. The rest, the $8.3 million, would require more paperwork, more legal processes, but it was there waiting for me, protected by Richard's careful planning and my own forgotten bank account from 20 years ago. As I stood to leave, Vincent said something that stayed with me. "Mrs. Chambers, your husband came to see me multiple times over those last 8 months. He wanted to make absolutely certain everything was ironclad, that no one could take advantage of you. He talked about you a lot, about how you'd given up everything to support his career, how you'd never asked for anything for yourself. He said you were the smartest person he'd ever met, even though you'd never finished college, and that you deserved to be taken care of for the rest of your life. Everything he did out of love for you." I'd nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat, and left the bank with my garbage bags, but this time they felt different. This time I wasn't a homeless woman with nowhere to go. I was a widow with $8.3 million, walking toward a hotel suite, carrying the evidence of my son's betrayal and my husband's love in equal measure. The Riverside Hotel lobby was elegant in an understated way, all marble floors and soft lighting, with staff who treated me with careful courtesy despite my garbage bags and disheveled appearance. The suite Vincent had arranged was on the 8th floor, with windows overlooking the river, a separate bedroom and living area, and a bathroom that was larger than the guest room I'd spent my last night in at what used to be my home. I dropped the garbage bags just inside the door and walked to the window, watching the river flow past, steady and inevitable. Somewhere across town, Marcus was probably discovering that his cards weren't working, that the accounts he'd thought he'd gained access to were frozen, that his mother wasn't quite as helpless as he'd assumed. I wondered what he was thinking, whether he felt any remorse or just anger at being caught. My phone rang, making me jump. Marcus's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for a long moment, then answered. "Mom," his voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "What did you do?" "My accounts are frozen. The bank is saying there's some kind of fraud investigation. You need to fix this right now." "I didn't do anything, Marcus," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "I just went to a bank to check on an old account. Turns out your father set up some protections I didn't know about." There was a pause, then his voice came back harder. "You can't do this. That money is mine. Dad left it to me. We had an agreement." "Did you?" I asked. "Or did you just assume you could take what you wanted and I'd be too stupid or too weak to stop you?" "Mom, you don't understand. Jennifer and we need that money. We've already committed to investments. If we don't come through with the capital, we'll lose everything." "You already lost everything, Marcus. The moment you threw your mother out with garbage bags the day after her husband's funeral, you lost everything that mattered. The money was never yours. Your father made sure of that." He started to argue, his voice rising, making threats and accusations, but I simply hung up. Then I turned off my phone entirely, setting it on the nightstand, done with his voice, done with his demands, done with being the person who absorbed everyone else's needs while my own disappeared. I ran a bath in that enormous bathroom, poured in some of the complimentary bath salts, and sank into water so hot it almost hurt. And finally, alone in that hotel suite, I let myself cry, not just for Richard's death, but for the marriage I'd thought I had, the son I'd thought I'd raised, the life I'd thought I was living. I cried until the water went cold, until my chest ached and my eyes burned, until there were no tears left. When I finally emerged, wrapped in the hotel's plush robe, I felt emptied out but strangely lighter. I ordered room service, something I'd never done before, choosing items without looking at the prices because Vincent had made it clear I didn't need to worry about money anymore. I ate slowly, tasting the food properly for the first time in days, and I thought about what came next. Tomorrow I would meet with the lawyers, start the process of claiming what Richard had left for me, begin building a life I'd never imagined I'd need to build alone. Tonight I would sleep in a comfortable bed, safe and warm, with 8.3 million reasons to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. Richard had protected me even in death. He'd seen what I couldn't see, anticipated what I couldn't anticipate, and made sure that when the worst happened, I wouldn't be left helpless. My son had tried to take advantage of my grief and my ignorance, but my husband had been smarter, had loved me more deeply than I'd even realized. I climbed into the enormous hotel bed, sank into pillows that felt like clouds, and for the first time since Richard's death, I felt something other than grief and fear. I felt angry, which was a start. And underneath the anger, I felt something else emerging. Something that might eventually become strength. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own revelations. But tonight I was safe. Tonight I had everything I needed. And that was enough. I woke up the next morning to sunlight streaming through the hotel windows, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar room. For a few seconds I thought I was on vacation with Richard, that we'd finally taken that trip we'd always talked about. Then reality crashed back in: the funeral, Marcus's betrayal, the shocking revelation at the bank. I reached for my phone out of habit, then remembered I'd turned it off last night. When I powered it on, the screen flooded with notifications. 17 missed calls from Marcus, 12 from Jennifer, and a series of increasingly frantic text messages that I scrolled through without opening. The hotel phone rang just as I was considering whether to order breakfast. When I answered, the concierge informed me that a Mr. Patterson from Patterson & Associates was waiting in the lobby and would appreciate a few moments of my time whenever I was ready. I told him I'd be down in 20 minutes, then rushed through a shower, pulling on the same clothes I'd worn yesterday because they were the only decent outfit in my garbage bags that wasn't wrinkled beyond recognition. James Patterson was exactly what I expected a high-powered estate attorney to look like, tall and distinguished with silver hair, and a suit that probably cost more than I used to spend on clothing in a year. But his eyes were kind when he shook my hand, and his voice was gentle as he suggested we talk in the hotel restaurant over breakfast. I followed him to a quiet corner table, hyper-aware of how out of place I must look in my day-old funeral clothes while he sat there looking like he'd stepped out of a magazine. "Mrs. Chambers," he began once we'd ordered coffee and I'd requested the simplest thing on the menu because my stomach was still uncertain. "I want to start by saying how deeply sorry I am for your loss. Your husband was not just a client but someone I considered a friend. We worked together for nearly 20 years. I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup, grateful for the warmth. Vincent at the bank said you were handling Richard's estate." Patterson nodded. "Your husband came to my office 8 months ago with very specific instructions. He just received a diagnosis that his heart condition was more serious than initially thought, and he wanted to ensure his affairs were in order. What he created was one of the most thorough estate plans I've seen in my 30 years of practice." The waitress arrived with our food, giving me a moment to process. Richard had spent 8 months preparing for his death, working with lawyers and bankers, setting up protections and trusts, and he'd never said a word to me. Part of me understood why talking about death plans would have made it all too real, would have stolen whatever time we had left. But another part of me felt hurt that he'd kept such important decisions from me. Patterson seemed to sense my thoughts. "He didn't tell you because he couldn't bear to," he said quietly. "Every time he came to my office he'd talk about you. How you'd given up your scholarship to support his early career. How you'd moved 7 times without complaint so he could take better positions. How you'd raised your son essentially alone because he was traveling so much. He said the greatest regret of his life was that he'd let you sacrifice so much without ever properly acknowledging what he'd asked of you." I felt tears threatening and blinked them back hard. I chose those sacrifices. I wanted to support him. He knew that. But he also knew that society doesn't value that choice, doesn't count it as work, doesn't give you a pension or a retirement account or social security benefits commensurate with the actual labor of maintaining a household and raising a child. Patterson pulled out a leather folder from his briefcase. He wanted to make sure that if anything happened to him, you'd be more than just comfortable. You'd be independent, secure, and completely in control of your own future. He opened the folder, revealing documents that I couldn't quite parse, legal language that swam before my eyes. "Let me explain this in plain terms," Patterson said, noticing my confusion. "Your husband's estate is valued at approximately $8.3 million. That includes the house in Riverside Heights, which is worth about $1.2 million, investment portfolios, retirement accounts, the life insurance policy, and various other assets accumulated over his career." "Marcus said everything was in his name now," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Patterson's expression darkened. "Your son was shown documents that explained he was listed as a contingent beneficiary and potential secondary trustee. That means if something happened to you, he would inherit. But those documents clearly stated that you were the primary beneficiary and sole trustee, with complete control during your lifetime." Either he profoundly misunderstood what he was reading, Or he deliberately chose to interpret them in a way that suited his purposes. He stole money from Richard's accounts, I said. Yesterday, before I even knew about any of this. He used power of attorney documents that weren't valid anymore. I'm aware. Patterson's voice was crisp. Vincent Carrington contacted me last night with all the details. Your son withdrew $150,000 in cash and transferred $300,000 to an account in his name. Those transactions were illegal, and we'll be pursuing full restitution as well as potential criminal charges. The word criminal hung in the air between us. My son, the baby I'd nursed through colic and walked through nightmares, was a criminal. He'd looked at his grieving mother and seen an opportunity for theft. The reality of it settled in my chest like a stone. Mrs. Chambers, Patterson continued, there's something else you need to know. Your son also attempted to access the house title yesterday afternoon. He went to the county recorder's office with documents claiming you'd agreed to sign the property over to him. Fortunately, the clerk processing the paperwork noticed irregularities and contacted our office for verification before filing anything. My hand shook as I set down my coffee cup. He was going to forge my signature. We believe so, yes. The documents he presented had a signature that was supposedly yours, but it clearly wasn't. We've retained those documents as evidence. Patterson's eyes met mine directly. Dorothy, may I call you Dorothy? Your son didn't just make a mistake or misunderstand his father's wishes. He engaged in deliberate, calculated fraud. He threw you out of your home, told you that you were essentially destitute, and then immediately began stealing everything he could access. This wasn't confusion. This was a plan. I thought about Marcus's face when he told me to leave, the coldness in his eyes, the way Jennifer had stood beside him nodding along. I thought about how quickly they'd moved, less than 24 hours after the funeral, how prepared they'd seemed with their explanations and their garbage bags. They'd been waiting for Richard to die so they could execute their scheme. What happens now? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Now we file a formal complaint with the police regarding the fraud and theft. We petition the court to recover all funds your son illegally accessed. We secure the house and all other assets in your name alone. And we make it very clear to your son that any further attempts to manipulate or intimidate you will result in immediate legal consequences. Patterson's voice softened slightly. I know this is your child, and that makes it incredibly painful. If you want to show mercy, if you want to give him a chance to return what he took and avoid prosecution, that's your choice. But you need to understand what he did was serious and it was deliberate. I sat with that for a long moment, remembering Marcus as a little boy, the way he'd run to me when he scraped his knee, the pride in his eyes when he'd graduated college, the joy on his face when Emma was born. But I also remembered the past few years, the increasing distance, the way he'd started talking to me like I was simple-minded, the embarrassment he seemed to feel about my lack of formal education. I remembered Jennifer's thinly veiled disdain for my homemaker lifestyle, her comments about women of her generation being more ambitious, more independent, as if raising a child and supporting a spouse wasn't ambitious or valuable. What would Richard want? I asked. Patterson smiled sadly. He anticipated that you'd ask me that. He actually wrote you a letter, to be delivered if circumstances like this arose. He pulled an envelope from the folder, my name written across it in Richard's familiar handwriting. This is for you to read privately, but he discussed the contents with me. He wanted you to know that protecting yourself wasn't betraying your son. He wanted you to understand that real love sometimes means holding people accountable for their actions. I took the envelope with trembling hands, couldn't bring myself to open it yet. The thought of reading Richard's words, knowing they were his last communication to me, felt too enormous to face in a hotel restaurant with a lawyer watching. Take your time with that, Patterson said gently. In the meantime, I need to go over some practical matters. First, the house. You are the sole owner. Marcus has no legal claim to it whatsoever. However, given what's happened, I'd recommend you don't return there alone. We can arrange for a locksmith to change all the locks today, and we can have someone from our office present when you go back to ensure your son hasn't damaged or removed anything. I nodded, trying to focus on logistics instead of emotions. What about the monthly allowance Marcus mentioned? $1,500? Patterson's expression turned contemptuous. There is no monthly allowance. Your husband left everything to you outright. You don't need anyone's permission or cooperation to access your own money. The trust structure was simply to provide tax benefits and asset protection, not to control your access to funds. You can withdraw, spend, invest, or donate any amount you choose at any time. So I'm not dependent on Marcus for anything. You're not dependent on anyone for anything, Patterson confirmed. You have complete financial independence. In fact, between the liquid assets and the investment accounts, you're generating approximately $40,000 per month in interest and dividends alone, without touching the principal. $40,000 a month. The number was so absurd I almost laughed. I'd been standing on a sidewalk with garbage bags yesterday, thinking I might need to find a homeless shelter, and all along I'd had access to more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. I know this is overwhelming, Patterson said. I'm going to leave you with my direct number. Call me anytime, day or night, if you have questions or concerns. I'm also going to recommend you speak with a therapist. What you're going through, the grief, the betrayal, it's a tremendous amount to process. We have someone we work with regularly who specializes in family conflict and estate disputes. I appreciated his concern, but therapy felt like something for other people who had the luxury of examining their feelings instead of just surviving them. Still, I took the card he offered, tucking it into my purse alongside Richard's letter. After Patterson left, I sat in the restaurant for another hour, nursing coffee that had gone cold, watching the morning crowd thin out as business lunches began. My phone kept buzzing with calls and texts from Marcus, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. What would I even say? I know you tried to steal everything from me, but let's have a civil conversation about it? Eventually I returned to my suite, sat on the edge of the enormous bed, and opened Richard's letter. His handwriting wavered in places, evidence of the tremor that had developed in his hands toward the end, but the words were clear and deliberate. My dearest Dorothy, he'd written. If you're reading this, then I'm gone and you've discovered that things aren't quite what they seemed. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you about these arrangements in person. Every time I tried, I looked at your face and couldn't bear to acknowledge that our time was running out. I chose cowardice over honesty, and for that I apologize. I need you to know that every decision I made regarding our estate was rooted in love and respect for you. You gave up your dreams to support mine. You moved across the country 7 times without complaint. You raised our son essentially as a single parent because my career demanded so much travel. You made our house a home, handled every crisis with grace, and never once made me feel like your sacrifices were a burden. Society tells women that what you did wasn't real work, that you were dependent on me, that you didn't earn the life we built together. That's a lie, Dorothy. You earned every penny of what I'm leaving you. You earned it through decades of unpaid labor, emotional support, and unwavering partnership. This isn't charity. This isn't me taking care of you. This is overdue compensation for work that should have been valued all along. I've become increasingly concerned about Marcus over the past few years. He's developed a sense of entitlement that troubles me, an expectation that he deserves financial support simply by virtue of being my son. I've watched him make poor business decisions, blame others for his failures, and show little appreciation for the advantages he's been given. More troubling, I've watched how he treats you, the dismissiveness, the barely concealed embarrassment about your lack of formal career. If he's reading this or if he's tried to convince you that I wanted him to control everything, I want you to know this explicitly. I did not leave my estate to Marcus because I do not trust him with it. I'm not punishing him. I'm protecting you. And perhaps, in a way, I'm protecting him from himself, from the temptation to squander what we built through bad investments and poor judgment. You may feel guilty about this, about accepting what I'm leaving you while Marcus gets nothing during your lifetime. Don't. You owe him nothing beyond what you've already given, which is everything. You raised him, loved him, supported him into adulthood. He is a grown man responsible for his own choices now. If he's angry, if he's hurt, if he feels entitled to more, those are his feelings to manage, not yours to fix. I want you to live, Dorothy. Really live. Travel to all the places we never had time to visit. Take that art class you mentioned 20 years ago. Buy books without checking the price. Eat at nice restaurants. Sleep late. Do absolutely nothing if that's what makes you happy. You've spent 43 years putting everyone else first. It's your turn now. And if you're reading this because Marcus has done something hurtful, something manipulative, something that's made you question his character, I need you to hear this. Protecting yourself from him is not a betrayal. Love doesn't require you to be a victim. Love doesn't mean accepting abuse. Love, real love, sometimes means setting boundaries and holding people accountable for their actions. I wish I had more time with you. I wish I could be there to help you navigate whatever challenges lie ahead. But I believe in your strength, even if you don't always see it yourself. You are the most capable person I've ever known, and you're going to be fine. More than fine. You're going to thrive. All my love, forever and always, Richard. I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face, before I carefully folded it and placed it back in the envelope. Richard had known. He'd seen Marcus's flaws clearly, had anticipated that our son might try to take advantage of my grief and confusion, and he'd made sure I'd be protected. The love in those words, the respect, the acknowledgement of everything I'd sacrificed, it was almost more than I could bear. My phone rang again. This time it wasn't Marcus but Jennifer. I stared at her name on the screen, remembering how she'd handed me those garbage bags, how she'd talked about my need for independence and personal growth while planning to steal everything I had. I answered. Dorothy, Jennifer's voice was tight and controlled. We need to talk about this situation. Marcus is extremely upset. The bank has frozen accounts that he needs for business operations. This is affecting our family's financial stability. Good, I heard myself say, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. He stole from me. He threw me out of my house. He tried to forge my signature on property documents. He can be upset all he wants. I hope he's terrified. There was a sharp intake of breath. You don't understand the pressure we're under. We've made commitments based on that money. Marcus thought it was his inheritance. He thought wrong. And now he's facing the consequences of theft and fraud. You can't do this to us. Jennifer's voice rose. Think about Emma and Lucas. Are you really going to let their father go to jail? Are you going to destroy your own grandchildren's lives? The manipulation was so blatant it would have been funny if it wasn't so insulting. Jennifer, I said, you and Marcus destroyed your own lives. You looked at a grieving widow and saw an easy mark. You threw me out with garbage bags and didn't even have the decency to feel ashamed. And now you're trying to use my grandchildren as leverage. It's not going to work. If you pursue this, if you press charges, we'll have no choice but to fight back. We'll tell everyone what kind of person you really are. We'll make sure the whole family knows that you chose money over your own son. The whole family, I repeated. You mean the son who threw me out and stole from me? The daughter-in-law who handed me garbage bags? Go ahead. Tell them. I'm sure they'll be fascinated to hear how you committed fraud and then tried to blame the victim. I hung up before she could respond, then blocked both her and Marcus's numbers. I was done being manipulated. Done being made to feel guilty for their choices. Done prioritizing their feelings over my own well-being. The rest of that day passed in a blur of phone calls and arrangements. Patterson's office coordinated with the police to file formal fraud charges against Marcus. A locksmith was scheduled to change all the locks at the house. A security company was hired to install cameras and an alarm system. Vincent at the bank walked me through the various accounts and investments, explaining my options and helping me understand the full scope of what Richard had left me. By evening I was exhausted, but I was also starting to feel something new. Not happiness exactly, the grief was still too raw for that. But perhaps the beginning of relief. The uncertainty of yesterday, the terror of homelessness and destitution, that was gone. I knew where I stood now. I knew what I had. And I knew that I didn't have to accept Marcus's version of reality anymore. I ordered room service again, this time choosing the most expensive thing on the menu just because I could. While I waited for the food to arrive, I pulled out my old laptop, the one I'd grabbed before leaving the house, and started making lists. Things I needed to buy, since all my belongings were still in those garbage bags. Places I wanted to see now that travel was actually possible. Classes I might want to take, skills I'd always wanted to learn. For 43 years I'd defined myself through other people. Richard's wife. Marcus's mother. The woman who supported and enabled and facilitated other people's dreams. I'd been good at it, had found meaning in it, but I'd also disappeared into it. And now, at 62 years old, I had the chance to figure out who Dorothy Chambers actually was when she wasn't being defined by her relationships. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. I had money, time, and freedom. I had no one to answer to, no one to take care of, no one whose needs came before my own. I could be selfish. I could be impulsive. I could make mistakes that only affected me. The possibilities were almost overwhelming. My food arrived and I ate slowly, savoring each bite, watching the river flow past my window as darkness fell. Somewhere out there, Marcus was probably raging, planning his next move, consulting with lawyers about how to fight my claims. Jennifer was probably calculating their options, figuring out how to minimize the damage to their reputation and finances. But their crisis wasn't my responsibility anymore. I thought about Emma and Lucas, my grandchildren, and felt a pang of sadness. They'd be caught in the middle of this, would probably be told that Grandma was being cruel and unreasonable. I'd likely lose access to them, at least for a while. But Patterson had been right about what Richard would have wanted. Real love sometimes meant setting boundaries, and teaching my grandchildren that stealing from grieving family members had consequences. That was a valuable lesson, even if it came at the cost of our relationship. Before bed, I turned on my laptop again and did something I hadn't done in decades. I searched for my old college, NYU, and looked up their continuing education programs. I'd been 19 when I dropped out, young and in love and certain that supporting Richard's dreams was the same as fulfilling my own. But I'd been studying art history, fascinated by the way artists across centuries had captured human experience, had made beauty and meaning out of pain and joy. The program still existed, updated for the modern era with online components and flexible scheduling. I could take classes without relocating, could finally finish the degree I'd abandoned all those years ago. It felt frivolous, unnecessary, the kind of thing that practical Dorothy Chambers would have dismissed as a waste of time and money. But I wasn't sure I wanted to be practical Dorothy Chambers anymore. I bookmarked the page, then shut down the computer. Tomorrow I'd deal with the house, with seeing Marcus face to face, probably, with all the complicated logistics of reclaiming my life. But tonight, I let myself imagine a future that looked nothing like my past. A future where I studied art history just because it interested me, where I traveled to see paintings and sculptures in person, where I spent my money and time on things that brought me joy instead of things that made me useful to others. Richard had given me that gift, the freedom to discover who I could be when I wasn't busy being what everyone else needed. And I was starting to think that maybe, just maybe, I was going to take him up on it. The grief wasn't gone, wouldn't be gone for a long time. But underneath it, something new was growing. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. The house looked different when I returned 3 days later, accompanied by Patterson's associate and a locksmith. The familiarity of the front walkway, the garden I'd tended for 15 years, the porch where Richard and I used to drink coffee on Sunday mornings, all of it felt like it belonged to someone else's life. The locks had already been changed per my instructions, and Marcus's frantic calls to the locksmith demanding entry had been ignored. I stood on the porch with the new key in my hand, taking a breath before stepping back into what was legally mine but no longer felt like home. Inside, the house was exactly as I'd left it on that terrible day, except for one thing. The living room had been stripped of several valuable items. The antique clock Richard's mother had given us was gone. The collection of first edition books from his study had disappeared. Even some of the artwork we'd collected over the years had been removed from the walls, leaving rectangular shadows on the paint. Marcus had come back after throwing me out and taken whatever he could carry, probably planning to sell it all before I discovered the truth about the estate. Patterson's associate, a sharp young woman named Caroline, photographed everything methodically, documenting the theft for the police report we'd be amending. I walked through the room slowly, cataloging what was missing, feeling strangely detached from it all. These were things Richard and I had chosen together, objects that represented memories and milestones, but they were just things. Marcus could have them. They couldn't hurt me anymore. In the bedroom I'd shared with Richard for 15 years, I found his reading glasses still on the nightstand, folded carefully the way he always left them. His slippers were tucked under the bed. His favorite cardigan hung on the back of the bathroom door. The mundane remnants of a life interrupted, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. I sat on the edge of the bed where Richard had slept beside me for thousands of nights, where we'd talked through problems and shared quiet mornings, and I let myself feel the full weight of losing him. Caroline gave me privacy, closing the bedroom door softly behind her as she went to document other rooms. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, and let the tears come. Not for Marcus or the betrayal, but for Richard. For the life we'd had, imperfect but genuine. For the future we'd planned but would never share. For all the conversations we'd never have, all the trips we'd never take, all the ordinary moments that had seemed so abundant until they were gone. When I finally emerged, red-eyed but steady, I found Caroline in the kitchen making tea without asking, just setting a cup in front of me with quiet understanding. The police came shortly after, taking my statement about the missing items, adding them to the growing list of charges against Marcus. They were professional and sympathetic, but I could see the judgment in their eyes. What kind of son does this to his own mother? What kind of family falls apart so completely? By late afternoon, we documented everything, changed the security codes, and installed new locks on every entrance. Caroline handed me a thick folder containing inventories, photographs, and legal documents, then squeezed my shoulder gently before leaving. The house was mine again, secured and protected, but standing in the empty kitchen as twilight settled outside, I realized I didn't want it. Too many ghosts lived here. Too many memories of who I'd been and who I'd thought my family was. I spent one night in the house, sleeping in the guest room because I couldn't bear the bedroom I'd shared with Richard. The next morning I called a realtor. The house sold within 2 weeks for $1.4 million, $50,000 over asking price, to a young couple expecting their first child. They walked through the rooms with such hope, such excitement about the future they'd build here, and I felt genuinely happy for them. This house deserved to shelter love and possibility, not grief and betrayal. Marcus tried to contest the sale, claiming he had rights to the property, but Patterson shut that down with documentation so thorough it left no room for argument. The fraud charges proceeded despite Jennifer's attempts to negotiate, despite messages from Marcus's friends suggesting I was being vindictive, despite a letter from Emma asking why Grandma was being so mean to Daddy. That letter hurt worse than anything else, seeing my 9-year-old granddaughter's handwriting, clearly coached by her parents, asking me to forgive and forget. Patterson helped me draft a response that Caroline delivered personally. I explained to Emma, in age-appropriate terms, that sometimes grown-ups make serious mistakes, and that Grandpa had left me in charge of taking care of myself because he loved me. I told her I loved her and Lucas very much, but that I needed to protect myself from people who tried to hurt me, even if those people were family. I didn't know if she'd understand or if Marcus and Jennifer would even let her read it, but I tried. 6 months after Richard's death, the legal proceedings concluded. Marcus pleaded guilty to fraud and theft to avoid jail time, receiving probation, community service, and a judgment requiring him to repay every dollar he'd stolen with interest. His credit was destroyed. His reputation in the business community was ruined. Jennifer filed for divorce 3 months into his probation, taking the kids and moving back to Connecticut to live with her parents. I felt sad about that, sad for Emma and Lucas caught in the aftermath of their father's choices, but I didn't feel guilty. I'd sold the house and moved into a beautiful apartment downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the river. I'd enrolled in NYU's continuing education program and discovered that at 62, I was a much better student than I'd been at 19. I actually cared about the material now, actually wanted to understand the context and meaning behind the art instead of just memorizing facts for exams. My professors treated me with respect, my younger classmates seemed fascinated by my perspective, and for the first time in my adult life, I was learning something purely for the joy of it. I'd also started volunteering at a women's shelter, helping newly divorced or widowed women navigate the financial systems that seemed designed to confuse and intimidate. I taught workshops on estate planning, on understanding investment accounts, on recognizing financial abuse. I shared my own story, not for sympathy, but as a cautionary tale about what could happen when you let others control your financial literacy. The work was meaningful in a way that surprised me, turning my pain into something useful for others. Richard's letter stayed in my nightstand drawer, and I read it sometimes when I needed to remember that I deserved this life I was building, that I'd earned it through decades of invisible labor, that accepting it wasn't selfish or wrong. The grief had softened over those 6 months, becoming less a constant ache and more a tender spot I could acknowledge and move past. I traveled too, finally seeing the places Richard and I had always talked about visiting. Paris, where I spent 2 weeks studying the Impressionists at the Musée d'Orsay. Florence, where I stood in front of the David and cried at its beauty. Barcelona, where Gaudi's architecture made me understand how art could be both whimsical and profound. I traveled alone and I discovered I liked my own company, liked making decisions without consulting anyone, Liked eating dinner at strange hours and changing plans on a whim. One afternoon, almost a year after Richard's death, I received an unexpected visitor at my apartment. Marcus stood in my doorway looking thin and tired, his eyes shadowed with something that might have been remorse. He asked if we could talk, and I let him in, curious about what he thought words could accomplish at this point. He apologized, or tried to. Spoke about pressure and poor judgment and fear of failure. Said he'd been wrong. Said he understood if I couldn't forgive him. But his apology felt rehearsed, strategic, the words of someone who'd been coached by a therapist or lawyer rather than genuine contrition. He never quite acknowledged the cruelty of throwing me out with garbage bags. Never quite admitted that he'd planned to steal from me all along. His apology focused on his pain, his losses, his struggles, with barely a mention of what he'd done to me. I listened until he finished, then told him the truth. I didn't forgive him. Maybe someday I would, but not now, not when the wounds were still healing. I told him that trust, once broken so completely, might never be repaired. That I hoped he'd learned something from this disaster he'd created, but that his growth wasn't my responsibility. I wished him well, genuinely, but I didn't want him in my life. He left looking smaller somehow, diminished, and I felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, just a quiet certainty that I'd made the right choice. Some relationships couldn't be salvaged, and pretending otherwise just prolonged the pain. 2 years after Richard's death, I graduated with my bachelor's degree in art history. I was 64 years old, walking across a stage in a cap and gown, receiving a diploma that represented not just academic achievement but reclamation of dreams I'd set aside so long ago. I thought about the 19-year-old girl who dropped out to support her boyfriend's ambitions, and I wished I could tell her that it wasn't too late, that she'd get her chance eventually, that the detour was long but not permanent. I had money, education, freedom, and purpose. I had friends I'd made through my classes and volunteer work, relationships based on who I was now rather than who I'd been. I had Emma's occasional letters, carefully written notes that suggested maybe someday we'd rebuild something, even if it could never be what it was. I had Richard's love, preserved in that letter I still kept close, reminding me that I was valued and seen and cherished. Marcus's betrayal had tried to destroy me, but instead it had freed me. Freed me from the obligation to shrink myself, to accept less, to prioritize everyone else's needs above my own. Richard's careful planning had given me the tools, but I'd done the work of transformation myself. At 64, I was finally becoming the person I might have been all along if I'd ever had the chance. The card that Vincent had given me that first day at the bank, the one that had revealed my hidden wealth and changed everything, I kept it in a frame on my desk. Not as a symbol of money, but as a reminder that sometimes salvation comes from unexpected places. That forgotten pieces of our past can become doorways to our future. That we're stronger and more capable than we've been taught to believe. Standing at my window watching the river flow endlessly past, I raised my coffee cup in a silent toast to Richard, to the life we'd shared and the one he'd made possible for me after he was gone. Then I turned back to my desk where my art history textbooks waited, where applications for graduate programs sat ready to be completed, where the rest of my life stretched out before me full of possibility and promise and hope. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.